let's talk about the zone of proximal development. Let's talk about what it is and how teachers can use it in the classroom. The psychologist's definition is the difference between what a student can do independently and what they can do with focused assistance. We can also think of this as a spectrum. One side will represent what students can do independently. This includes skills that are too easy for students because they've already been mastered, and that means there's no learning taking place. On the other side of the spectrum is what students cannot do on their own. Information here is too complicated and tasks are too hard for students to complete without direct assistance from the teacher. And again, no learning can take place. In between these two sides is what's known as a ZPD, or the zone of proximal development. A theory created by a psychologist of the name Lev Vygotsky. It suggests that there is what he calls a sweet spot for learning. He says that the ZPD is where instruction is most beneficial because it is just beyond a student's current level of individual capabilities. You see, Lev Vygotsky thought of learning and development in a series of steps. That is, once a student had mastered the information of one step, then and only then would they be ready to move on to the next step, which would be slightly more challenging in content. And once they'd mastered that step, then they would be able to move on to the next step, and so on. This next step is what Vygotsky meant when he said the sweet spot. And the best way to assist students at this step is by using what he calls scaffolding. But that's not all he thought was important. In fact, did you know that a student's social interaction with significant individuals, like teachers or peers or even parents, can profoundly shape not only the interpretation of the world, but also affect higher order thought processes? This means that students can learn a lot from working in groups or with the teacher, a lot more than they could on their own. And it brings us back to Vygotsky's main idea of scaffolding. Scaffolding is defined as structurally supportive interactions that guide effective learning. As a teacher, you can use scaffolding in a multitude of ways. You can use it by modeling behaviors. It can be as simple as walking all your students through the steps on how to fold a paper airplane, making sure they follow along with all the steps, that you're watching to make sure that they understand every step of the way as you yourself complete the task. You could also simplify problems, making sure to build on students' prior knowledge without making things too complicated. In fact, solving these slightly more challenging problems can actually be rewarding to students. And another way may be as simple as keeping their attention on the tasks. This means eliminating outside distractions or even keeping the task engaging and new. But what's the point? The point is that as a teacher, it may feel like your job is to orchestrate 100% success for a student and for your class, that you alone are responsible for their learning and their education. But that's not the case. Instead, by teaching in the ZPD, that is, using your instructions, plus some scaffolding, and maybe even some group interactions, group projects, or group discussions. You as a teacher can actually help your students get the most out of learning. You see, the ZPD can be very helpful because in the end, the goal is, in fact, learning.